hello, bonjour, everybody. It's great to see everybody, and some others are still filing in. So this is our Voices of Diversity. Um, we've been changing, we have many ways of calling it. We've called it a speaker series, a podcast, an interview. It's everything and all of it, and its own thing as well. And so we are speaking with an amazing, diverse guest every month since July of this past summer. And today we have the honor of talking to Kamala Mackerel. And myself, I'm Mike Fan. I'll be hosting today and interviewing. And I am the PGSS Equity and Diversity Commissioner for graduate students regarding EDI issues. And I'm also proud to be a music student at the Schulich School of Music at McGill, completing my master's in opera and voice performance. And so we're really happy that you all made time in your day, in the middle of your day, or depending on what time zone you are, whatever time you're here at, to come and enjoy some company together. And we'll have some time at the end for everyone to talk and ask some questions and to interact directly in this space. So we're thrilled to have you all. Before we begin, I would like to just begin with a territorial land acknowledgement, and then we'll dive in. So we would like to begin by acknowledging that McGill University is located on unceded Indigenous lands. The Kanien'kehá:ka Nation is recognized as the custodians of the lands and waters on which we gather today. Tiohtià:ke, commonly known as Montreal, is historically known as a gathering place for many First Nations. Today it is home to a diverse population of many First Nations. Today, it is home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We respect the continued connections with the past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples within the Montreal community. Nous aimerions commencer par reconnaître que l'Université McGill est située en territoire autochtone, lequel n'a jamais été cédé. Nous reconnaissons la nation Kanien'kehá:ka comme gardienne des terres et des eaux sur lesquelles nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui. Tiohtià:ke ou Montréal est historiquement connu comme un lieu de rassemblement pour de nombreuses Premières Nations et aujourd'hui une population autochtone diversifiée ainsi que d'autres peuples y résident. C'est dans le respect des liens avec le passé, le présent et l'avenir que nous reconnaissons les relations continues entre les peuples autochtones et autres personnes de la communauté montréalaise. And I'm going to put a link in the chat as well, which is native-land.ca. And if you're not currently in Montreal, which I know at least one of you isn't, then you can look at the territorial land acknowledgements for where you are. Obviously at McGill, we represent McGill in the Montreal community, but in this virtual space, not all of us are actually physically here. But we want to represent, of course, this university and city, which we represent, but not everyone is here. So I encourage you to get curious and to educate yourself. So we're super excited, and I will introduce Kama with a little clip from a video and also the bio. I just wanted to also just provide some ground rules, some guidelines for this space. So obviously we want to keep this a safe space. For the first portion, it will be Kama and I having an interview, and then we'll open the space later for some questions. So for this first part, we're going to be recording, which is currently happening, and then I will stop it once we have more interaction. So if you don't want your video or your name to be recorded, then this first part, only the people speaking will have their images recorded. So you can feel free to be anonymous, and then we'll have a space where you can, if you like to, you can show your video and unmute yourself and ask questions, and it is going to be totally safe space, which is not going to be recorded. So, but just to sort of provide some info about how the recording is working, and just FYI, if you don't feel comfortable showing your video, you're welcome to at all times, of course. We love to see you and interact with you. If you feel uncomfortable or you're not able to, you can leave your video off, you can use an alias, you can be whoever and be whoever you want to be in this space. This is a space for you to feel safe and to honor what you need. And yes, and obviously I'm sure we all know about Zoom etiquette. If you could keep yourself muted until the end, If there's anything, other issues, you can write it in the chat, or if you can't hear me or something like that, feel free to let me know also, because it's Zoom after all. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the space we want to hold and create for each other today, and for Kama in particular. So this is the super fun part where I get to read the bio. I don't know how you feel, Kama, but sometimes it can feel awkward just sort of hearing wonderful things about yourself, but it never hurts, right? We could all use some more self-love. So I'm sharing this screen. Hopefully everyone can see this from the press kit. Unfortunately, we don't have the capability for live sub-captioning, so I just wanted to provide a visual element also, if that helps. So we are so excited to have for our third Voice of Diversity speaker series, Kamala Mackerel, who is beyond definition and defies all boxes and is just incredible. And so Kamala Mackerel is a Montreal-based Mauritian-Canadian multidisciplinary artist, educator, community arts facilitator, and literary translator, among many other things, who works within and across performance, photography, installations, textiles, digital art, and literature. They have exhibited and performed their work internationally, and their writing in English, French, Francais, and Creole has appeared in publications both online and in print. They have lived in far-flung places such as India, Ontario, and Zomfam is their first book. And it was also our pick for our Equity and Allyship Book Club, which happened on Monday, which some of you who are there are here. So that's super exciting, because I'm sure you have lots of questions you want to bring to the table. It's amazing discussions about that. Kama's work has been published in the Lambda Literary Award-winning anthology Glitter and Grit, Queer Performance from the Heels on Wheels, Femme Galaxy, and we mark your memory, writings from Descendants of Indenture. Their translation of Kai Chung Tom's From the Stars in the Sky to the Fish in the Sea was published in French by Éditions Don de Lyon in spring 2019, and their co-translation of Vivek Shraya's I Am Afraid of Men was published en français aussi by Éditions de Rému Ménage in winter 2020. They are presently translating Kai Chung Tom's novel Fierce Femmes and Notorious Liars, great name, which is scheduled for publication in fall 2021. And just to give you a little bit more of an audio-visual introduction as well, I'm just going to play a little bit of this video about Zomfam, which hopefully you're seeing, and shortly we'll also be able to hear and put on the captions. Great. So this is a little bit about Kama's new release, and a little bit about themselves to give you a little bit of context, if you're not already familiar with this incredible artist and this incredible poetry.
Dig mountains with the edges of your hip bones. Skirt temples from the softness of your lips. Make homes for the sacredness of your stories. Your body is home. Your body is an island. Your body is home. Your body is the ocean. Hi, my name is Kamala Mackerel, and I'm a Mauritian-Canadian multidisciplinary artist and writer living in Bijage, also known as Montreal, and this is Zomfam, my debut poetry collection. Your body is home. Your body is an island. Your body is home. Your body is the ocean. I work in performance, in poetry, in visual art, in installation, and I love working across media to be able to find multiple ways, multiple points of access to articulate ideas, feelings, moods, politics, aesthetics. So I really love working in interdisciplinary processes. Zomfam started actually as a creative process that was not meant for the page. I didn't know in the beginning that I would be writing a book. There are 8 pieces in the book because they're long lyric poems, and each of the pieces were initially written as separate spoken word pieces. I wrote them as like 10 to 12 minute spoken word pieces, and it's only with time that I realized that through each of the separate pieces there was actually a storyline. There was something else that I was trying to articulate. There was a deeper story that was asking to emerge from that process. That's when I started working on Zumfam, the show actually, which is a 75 minutes show, and it was only after I started preparing this manuscript for the stage that I realized, oh, there's also space to turn this manuscript into some form of experiment that could exist on the page. So the Zumfam as a book, as a poetry collection, came at a later point in the process. But from the very beginning, though, the poetry, the performance piece and the spoken word pieces were written as poetry. But I didn't know or think at the time when I started that they would also become a book by the end of it. Her dreams.
Cool. There we go. Wonderful. And this is an amazing video, which I will share in the chat as well. And you can learn more about this book. Is that all right, Kama? I can put this link also.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
Yes, yes. And I really encourage you. It's been one of my favorite reads of the year, and I'm sure all time also. And it's wonderful to be able to support a local Montreal artist, writer, and press as well too. But we will definitely talk more about this also. So a round of applause, silent applause probably for the most part, for the amazing Kama today. We're so thrilled that you all could make it and that Kama could join us in these crazy times. So welcome, bienvenue. Wonderful, wonderful to see you. Amazing. So as well, just to give everyone some context also, so this event also is being held in collaboration with Queer History Month, the third annual Queer History Month. And that's super exciting because actually I became aware of Kama and Kama's work last year. I don't know if even Kama remembers. So there's the closing ceremony for last year's second annual Queer History Month, and Kama was performing, and I performed a little bit at the open mic. I don't think we actually got to speak very much, but I just remember Kama's performance was so iconic. I was so blown away, and I just had it in my mind. I thought, this is someone special. And so this year, when I had this PGSS equity platform, I was super excited, and we were really happy to be able to bring Kama in for them to share more about themselves, their work, their story. And this is technically really our first official time really getting to know each other. So this is super exciting, and really excited. I feel like it's all very full circle now. And I believe recently you were also doing an event for Queer History Month as well. Is that correct? Did that end up happening?
No, not this year. I've done events for Queer History Month, well, for the past 3 years that it has happened actually. So yes, indeed, last year I hosted the closing open mic. Yeah, but not this year. No, this is the only Queer History Month engagement that I'm doing this year. But
Wonderful.
it is a program that's dear to my heart, and that's been meaningful and important within the McGill context, and more broadly also within the Montreal context, because there's just been a lot of really interesting speakers, programming that, yes, it's McGill, but also like the bigger queer community of Montreal also has access to this, which I think is amazing for the city.
Yes, absolutely. Particularly now in these times, we're talking a lot about this very loaded McGill history, and so it's really exciting that we're also able to kind of bring other voices that have been suppressed systemically over the years at McGill, and carry a new face forward for this university. And speaking of which, so I'm wondering if, especially because most of the others on this call are current grad students or students at McGill, wondering if you can provide some context for your experience at McGill and your ties to McGill, and any memories you have, speaking of Queer History Month, but also beyond. Yeah, it'd be really interesting to hear.
Yeah, sure.
Well, good, bad, and ugly. If you're willing, whatever you're comfortable sharing.
Of course. I thank you. I mean, thank you everyone for also just being present today and being part of this discussion. Even if I don't quite see you, it's the awkward Zoom thing. But thank you for being present in whichever way your presence can be honored. in this moment. It's interesting, my relationship with McGill, because I didn't study at McGill University, and because I was never a student in Montreal. I moved to Montreal to work a few years ago. Almost a decade ago now. But I kind of, like McGill University is this imposing, colonial force that looks over the entire city, right? Like, I mean, like, talk about the literal ivory tower. Who thinks of building a university on the top of a hill? And I like to call it the literal ivory tower. And and of course, within like my Montreal communities, I've known people who historically, who have been to McGill, like different generations of students, mostly queer trans people of color, who have gone to McGill and heard firsthand experiences about like what it was like to study at McGill. But I didn't quite get it. I didn't quite understand it until in 2016, 2017, I believe. Yeah. So that academic year, I did an 8-month artist residency in the Faculty of Education at McGill, and that was the first time I was actually within the institution. Like that's the first time I actually understood like I like in the sense of
Mm.
like in terms of my lived experience. And I
Yes.
wasn't even, that's the thing, I wasn't even there as a student, right? Like I
Right.
was an artist in residence. There's a way in which like there's so much more freedom, like I'm not dealing with the same kind of power dynamics. But then to realize how much academia, North American academia, and McGill specifically is about, like it's kind of like, yeah, there's a lot of egos
Mm.
within the space, and there's a lot of power dynamics that play out within it. But the tragedy of it, I think, like the hardest part of it, is that the people who are impacted are actually the most marginalized,
Yeah.
right? Like, and I think, and yeah, and it was interesting for like when I came out of this experience, I said like I have whole new levels of respect for anybody, particularly people who are marginalized, who study at McGill, because I was like, whoa, how the hell do you do this? And I wasn't even there as a student. I was there for just 8 months, and also I wasn't in the same, like it's not like I had like I wasn't in the same kind of power relationship, because I had more independence, and it was something I could quit if I wanted to quit, unlike if you're getting through school or like different circumstances. Yeah, and I think I do think, I mean, the one thing that I say, like I think it's very important, first of all, like to take care of yourself and not define yourself in the terms of the university, because that's what
Yes.
academia does. Academia has a structure, a particular kind of sense, and then will measure your self-worth, like your worth, based on that. And of course, as human beings, we internalize this, and then it becomes tied to our self-worth. And I think that's self-worth, sorry. And I think that's something that is important to work against, and to push back against. On the one hand, like it's important to push back, but then on the other hand, I think it's important to also just find your people. Like I think being in a place like McGill, yeah, it's key to find ways, concrete ways of taking care of yourself, of not letting the institution define who you are, define your worth, and also not letting the institution erase you, because
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally, I mean, the fact that James McGill was a slave owner, right? Like the fact that this property that they're still, like a couple of years ago, there was like yet another dispute from a group of an indigenous group around, like even the land, right? Like, and the land that belongs to McGill University. And I think there's that violence, right? There's this colonial violence that's so already embedded in the foundation of it, in the creation of it, and that still plays out in multiple ways. And I think it's important, as we navigate these institutions as marginalized people, to find ways to take care of ourselves, to find ways not to, so that we don't end up erased,
Mm-hmm.
because the institution is not built up for people with experiences like ours, right? Like,
Yes.
so that's what I would say about Miguel.
Yes. That's really a beautiful point, and definitely something I wanted to bring forward first for especially this community, which is at McGill, because it's, yeah, I love what you said about that. As if being a student and being in this, late teens to early 20s, where there's so much happening already in life, and the traditional university experience already is so difficult, and then adding on a layer of being marginalized in some way, where whether it's gender, sexuality, religion, ethnicity, or all of the above, it's a lot. And it's something, yeah, personally for me, I had grown up a lot of my life in Ontario, done my formal schooling. I did two undergrads both in Ontario, and coming to Quebec first of all, and then coming to McGill, it was definitely a big change. And
Mm-hmm.
a lot of the issues you talked about, absolutely. This institution, and specifically at McGill, big institutions, I think it's tricky because there is this kind of sense of, you know, conforming and losing oneself in this hierarchy and in this kind of institution. And then at McGill, there's also particular issues which I think are really being talked about openly. And like when I walk into the Schulich School of Music, there's a big Queen Victoria statue, and on one sense, it's wonderful to see a female leader represented because there's, you know, an oppression of gender over the years, but at the same time, she represents a very heavy colonial trauma and heritage. So it's definitely. As I started to experience McGill myself, just like you said, it definitely starts to really open up a lot of uh, lived experience, because hearing about
Mm-hmm.
it's one thing, and then experiencing it, it's another. It's a place of possibility, but it's also a place of, yes, a lot of issues. And yes, and speaking of this kind of colonial mindset and history of McGill, one of the really interesting threads in your book is this colonial history as well with Mauritius, where you grew up. And speaking of education as well, is I really love that the one poem that was talking about the Royal College and the colonial history with the institutions on that island as well too. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about this very, because one of the things that in our book club was really interesting was Mauritius, which a lot of people know about, and this intersection with the colonial dynamics, and specifically in terms of institutions as well. I mean, this is quite a very big. It's not really a question. It's more like a jumping off point, I guess. But I'm wondering if you could elaborate and kind of to discuss a little bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, it's interesting because like in the book, I mean, I explore it in so many ways, right? Like, and one of them being um, through that lens of education. But I think one of the things that's important to remember is that we've all, and that's the case, like for all spaces that have been colonized and became post-colonial countries through whatever thread of colonization, right? Like, is that there's actually a colonial legacy that was left behind, and that colonial legacy a lot of times was also framed, well, one, within language, right? Like when you think of like the supremacy of English or French, as I mean, for me, I grew up in that colonial context of, Mauritius was both colonized by the British and the French, right? Like, and to the extent where just the use of language, so for example, the
Mm-hmm.
use of, if you speak French, is seen like, there's a class element to it, right? Like if you speak French, that means, so French is valued over Creole or other local languages, right? Like, which is just like
Mm-hmm.
in terms of that, but then also how that language is framed, right? Like the language of the queen. And then you end up with an education system, right? That actually um, replicates this, like in Mauritius, just like in Sri Lanka or in Singapore or other places that were colonized by. I was talking to an artist, a queer artist, that I was working with the other day, who's from Ghana, and we were actually working on this scene in the show. And then he was telling me, "Oh, that's interesting because I had the same education system in Ghana, right? Like the Cambridge international exams, the O levels and the A levels, which is the British education system, which all those post-colonial countries inherited." Right, like including Mauritius. So, which makes it such that, by the age of 14, I was already reading Shakespeare in school.
Mm-hmm.
But had I read anything local, like
Mm-hmm.
not at all.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to think about like the multiple ways in which like we can talk about it in terms of education, but the legacy, like yeah, the legacy is bigger, right? Like that colonial inheritance is even larger than that. Like just
Mm,
I think we could expand it to so many things, like the gender binary in itself, right? Like as being a colonial tool,
mm-hmm.
in that sense, and the multiple systems, legal, medical, and and I think the intersections of how we see gender and sexuality within now those quote unquote post-colonial spaces, right, is also important. So those are all the things that I wanted to unpack um, through the book, right? Like through each of
Yes.
those stories. But also to, one of the things that for me was very intentional about this book is, nothing is in black and white, right? Like everything is actually written in nuances, in the sense of, I wanted to honor the ancestors' dream, my parents' dream, and how much it meant to them
Yes.
that I was finishing school, right? Like, and for them, it was about class mobility because they came from the plantation inheritance, but at the same time, um, that was also violent for me as an experience because going through the ivory tower was uh, also going through another form of colonial
Mhm,
violence, but both
mhm.
of those coexist, right? It's not that one is good and the other one is bad. I think that's the other part that I wanted to also kind of portray in multiple ways throughout the story, because like yeah, throughout the book, because nothing is in black and white in this book, like everything's
Yes.
like this is one truth and this is another truth and they coexist and here's another one, so I really wanted to work with that. But yeah, and yeah, think through, like yeah, what are the ways for me as the first person who finished school, the first person who went to university, what it meant for me, but also what it meant for my parents, what it would
Yes.
mean for my ancestors, and then what are the colonial legacies that I carry within me, right? Like what is it that yeah, so I wanted to make space for all of that um, in those stories, but specifically in this piece that specifically talks about like yeah what it
Yes.
meant
Very explicitly in
for
that
me.
one, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I love that that there is this beautiful level of ambiguity because life is not black and white. It's not just this box and that box. And one thing I really remarked for myself is that yes, there's gender, there's colonialism, there's coming of age, there's there's race, there's class, but it's not like this poem is about this, and now we're gonna go into this. It's all tied together and woven in this beautiful meshwork, and it's just like life because we go through life and it's just lots of different emotions, feelings, issues all tied together, and I thought that was really masterful the way it happened. At the same time, you can go back and examine it from one lens, but it's just you know very subtle in the way it's woven together and very masterful. And I really thought the use of the Creole language and the local languages, that was very powerful because, as you said, language can have a very colonial kind of loading with it. The use of English or French, and some of the book club members, there was a part of them that also said that reading that also uh, made them realize that even though they could read or get to know someone about their experiences, they're part of their experience that belongs to them, and including this language element. At the same time, I think it also opens people's eyes to this culture, this beautiful, vibrant culture. And so, could you talk a little bit about the importance of that to you, including that language there, and knowing that it may not be understood by most of the readers, and maybe did you have any thoughts about that or
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was very intentional in terms of the work, right? Like, I mean, it's a
yes,
book that's primarily written in English, at least in this
yes,
version. And the title of it is Fam, right? Like the title is not in English, and there's no appendix, there's no
exactly,
appendices that come.
exactly,
There's nothing is translated in the book
yes,
in that sense. And the title itself, right? Like, and I think one of the big questions that I asked myself was like, somebody's going to see this on a bookshelf in a bookstore, and they're not even going to know what it means, right?
Yes.
Like, and that was very intentional for me,
Yes.
as a form of decentering colonial languages.
Hmm.
Because in many ways, I mean, like the entire book, it's kind of like there's this meta discourse happening because it's a book of
Yes.
poetry that's talking about languages, right? Like
Yes.
it's all about like silences, what can we say, what can we not say, what are the languages of love, like like that thread of like goes throughout, like the father giving a name as language, or the father building a house but not being like communicative, and then there's the conversation with the mother, right? Like that question of language and
Yes.
finding languages as people who have been colonized, right? Like that honor us in ancestral ways are very much at the center of the book. And yeah, it was very intentional for me. It was a personal aesthetic but also a political choice, to have the title Bizum Fam, because it's not just a linguistic performance, right? Like it's not just about language, but it's also um an yeah, a decentering of a Western way of being, right? Like it doesn't say transgender there, it doesn't say queer, it says Zumfam, right? Like as and that part is an honoring of the multiple ways in which pre-colonial societies actually gender non-conforming people
Yes.
have always existed, right? Like, and there's that it's actually the colonial intervention with the gender binary that erased those ways of being, and that includes what happens here on Turtle Island, right? Like in Canada, in terms of what
Yes.
now we call two-spirit people, right? Like, but actually, gender variant peoples have always been present in many indigenous
Yes.
communities across the land, right? Like, and we're actually the first person, and I think that part of colonial history is important because the very first person who were murdered when the colonizers got to this land were actually the gender non-conforming
Yes.
people, because though in that sense, like being trans or being gender non-conforming was about your spiritual and your social role that you had within a society and within a community, which was not which was not tied to like gender as like the body, the way it's understood within a Western framework. And there was that need, right, like to, because those people were actually the spiritual leaders of their communities, so you actually had to kill the leaders first so
Yes.
that you can then enslave the people and then extract the resources from the land, right? Like, so um and there's this entire history, right? Like, because a lot of times we talk about colonial history in economic terms
Yes.
within the lens of capitalism, but I'm like, yeah, there's also something very gendered that was actually embedded in it.
Yes.
um and so to go back to this, yeah, so the use of Creole throughout in that unapologetic way where it's not translated is about like decentering,
Yes.
right? Like decentering the dominant experience where like, yeah, this time around, like, I mean, it's also a show, right? It's also a performance. You can see the performance. You as a, if you're a white audience, like you get to be alienated instead of the other way around, right? Like, and
Yes.
it's the same with the book. It's up to you to do your homework. You want to know what Zamfam means, like go Google it, go do
Exactly.
your reading, like um so that was important for me. And then I think there was just a general sense of being able to honor the multiple local languages, and then also the question of what can be translated, right? Like what can
Yes.
be the very last piece, which is actually called Zumfam, right? Like actually talks about like Zumfam as a gendered terms and how um like, yeah, it's like um as a gendered term, but also as an ancestral term.
Yes.
Where's that line that I'm looking for? Where I actually say, oh yeah, there is a voice that did not go to school, does not speak English, does not speak French, yet echoes wisdom and truth in my bloodstream, like the waves of the oceans that witness the loss of our languages. And that voice, this is on page 93, and that voice tells me that I do not need an imperial language to define myself, that I do not need to be trans in English or in French, that colonialism has already wrapped itself like a knot around my vocal cords, right? Like, so it's very actively a decentering, like a sort of like decolonial exercise around language that is tied to queerness and gender. Yeah.
Yes, so beautiful, and that's really wonderful, and I love that it just goes beyond the page because as you were saying in the video, and and what you've expressed is that this book is also came from live performance, and then it also intended to kind of unite, so that you not only get to see it on the page, you get to hear it and feel it. And I think that's super powerful too. And something that really resonated with me as well is that that, as you're saying, if there's people who are uncomfortable with not knowing or not being presented with like an appendix or something like that, that for marginalized people, that's how they walk in the world every day. And I think that's very eye-opening to read that and be in that space of not knowing or being uncomfortable or being not knowing one's way around. I think that's really and that word decentering which you use, I think that's so powerful. And yeah, and I love that page in particular where you have Zomfam all across the page, and that's so beautiful and so simple, yet I'm just gonna for my beautiful copy as well. Yes, I feel like if everyone had one, we should just do this as like a sign of solidarity or something. But this was, when I saw that, for me it was just so powerful, especially as I have very recently kind of stepped more into my gender neutrality, gender queerness, just to see that, what that word represents, and just to see it, because I think it's about representation, right? And I mean, could you talk about that, and also in terms of how important it is to see representation of marginalized identities and people, on the page, on screen?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are two things in terms of that at play. The first one being, I mean, throughout the book, like it's not written as like there's like the text
Yes,
is
this
I
is
is
in.
performing on the page, like yeah, and
Yeah.
that's very
Yes.
intentional.
Yes.
That's not just
Yes.
an aesthetic decision. The thing for me is um, the so the poetry was written initially as performance, right? Like it's actually a show that was supposed to premiere first in April, but
Yes.
then got canceled, and then a
Yes.
couple of weeks ago, but now it's again canceled. So I don't know when this show is gonna hit a stage, but hopefully someday. And yeah, so there was this one of the things that I wanted to do in this work was, so like with the show, the question that I was obsessed with was how would the poetry move on stage? What if poetry could move through the body across space?
Yeah.
What would that look like? And that became the performance. And then when I decided to turn the manuscript into a book, I wanted to bring the performative side,
Yeah.
and also in my case, my visual arts practice as well, into the book. Because I wanted, so I really thought about it as like, what if the body of the text is performing on the page the
Yeah.
same way that my body performs on the stage, right? So that's why um, the words are placed like this throughout the story, because I wanted that performative aspect. I wanted the body of the text to perform on the page.
Yes.
So which was one part of what I do with this work. But then the other part of it was also like a form of decentering, right? Like decentering again, like the that sort of um, dominant narrative of beginning, middle, and end, right?
Yes.
Like the straight line as a, this book is all about multiplicities, as I've
Yes.
said. It's very nuanced, and it's about, and I see that for me as an
Yes.
anti-colonial and as the decolonial project. Sure, we can call it a queer project as well if we want, but like, um, and for me, it's very much, like just the fact that I'm a multidisciplinary artist, it's pushing
Yes.
against the categorization of disciplinarity, right? Like, and how we frame disciplines, right? Like, and then how also we have this gatekeeping around this discipline,
Yes.
right? Like, and for me, probably as a self-taught artist, it was important to push back against this. So I think part of what I do with this is like, because like when you look at conventional poetry, it's just like lines on the page, and I
Yeah.
wanted to push back against that as a tradition,
Yeah.
as a way of writing, to
Yes.
bring more orality into the work. to bring, yeah, and maybe to, yeah, and to answer the second part of your question. Oh, I love this page so much. There's some of them that are just like, yeah, and
Yeah.
you know, and when it gets to this double spread in where you see some fam spread across the page like this, like, then I'm like, at this point it's towards the end of the book, right? And I've been dealing with it and building upon it, and by then I'm just exploding the language altogether, right? Like it's like a dance on the page. um and yeah, so yeah, like that's, yeah, that's something that's very intentional. But I think, so to go back to the second part of your question around representation, is that I think on the one hand there is a representation like um in the more direct ways we think about it, like, like how many gender non-conforming bodies or how many bodies of color do you see in your magazines, on your billboards,
Mhm.
etc. Or any space,
Yeah.
right? Like, but I think there's also then the how do you what I try to do, for me at least, with this work and with all my work, I would say, is also how to question not just what is being represented, but also how it's being represented. And I think it's very important with
Yeah.
language. It ties back to what we were saying earlier around language, right? Like if we um yeah, if we are to be working with, like, I mean, I don't know much about music, but like I'm sure like music is like something that's like so strict within its tradition, right? Like within the Western tradition,
Especially
right?
in
Like,
classical music, yeah, with this also
yeah,
colonial legacy, also, absolutely.
exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And I think there's a question of what do we represent, but also there's a question of how do we play with the form? How do we question the form?
Yes.
Yeah, so that part is also important for me.
Yes, that's beautifully said. And that's something that we're talking a lot about in classical music too, because there's new work being written, there's a lot of ways to, gender bend the canon, but we are interacting with audiences and a tradition that is very loaded, and even with language, as you're saying, I love writing poetry as well, and growing up in school, being taught poetry, and reading these great works where it looks a certain way, it's aligned a certain way, it's capitalized a certain way. So I think that's beautiful, even with the visual element on the stage, where that tears down that fabric, which is so embedded. And I love how, and I think it's being, received so, your work in general, and not just with Zomfam, but in general, and you as a person are so inspirational and so visionary for people, because you're so outspoken and you're so eloquent and so powerful, yet having so much grace and being so articulate. But I'm really curious to know if this has always been the case, or if that was a journey getting there, and are there moments or a moment that was particularly defining in terms of getting your strength and, really being the force and the voice you are now today? Um, yeah, I'm just curious if you're like born with that. I mean, it's we all grow and learn too. It's not just you're the same person you were necessarily, but or was that a journey to kind of find that strength within yourself?
Thank you. Thank you for saying this. I do want to respond to this first by saying that, like this is I think a lot of times, like particularly as artists, like, like you get to see me. I'm the one who's doing the Skype,
Visibly,
the
yeah,
Zoom call right now or whatever, but like, but I don't operate alone, right? Like there's not
absolutely.
just me. There is a community of people, which is my support network and the people who are around me.
It's a village.
Yeah, yeah, no, totally.
Right.
It's more than a village, right? Like it's like there's that to start with. There are the people who loved me before I even knew how to love myself.
Yes.
Which is what, like, that piece, "Your body is the ocean,"
Yes.
in the book is about this, right? Like, and the last line of the poem is, you will, because it's kind of like, the adult speaking back to the child, and the last line of the poem is, "You will not learn to love yourself, but
Yeah.
I am learning to love you," right? Like, so
Absolutely.
I think there's that part, and then there's the lineage, right? Like the history of the people who paved the way. And I think it's important for us to think about this, think about, like, what makes our presence possible, what makes our voice possible, right? And there's been a lineage of people, of queer and trans people of color, who historically have resisted, like we think about ancestry a lot in terms of blood ancestry, but I think it's important for us to think about it in terms of
Yes.
queer ancestries as well, right? Like,
Absolutely.
how is it that Marsha P. and Sylvia Rivera and Miss Major Griffin Gracie, as a Black trans women, what did they do, like 50 years ago, to actually pave the way for somebody like me as a Black trans femme to exist, right? Like, um, so thinking about like those histories in multiple ways, the fact that I can write and publish within a Canadian context is because, like, there are people who've paved the way for me. Like, I'm thinking of Vivek Shoya, I'm thinking of Amber Dawn, Leia Lakshmi Thiepsna, Sarah Masina, like at the time when queer artists couldn't even get published, right? Like, or
Yes.
get queer artists of color. So all this to say is, like, I think it's important, like, yes, there's, thank you for saying those nice things about me, but it's not just about me, right?
Absolutely.
Like, I come from a lineage, and I've learned from the lineage. That's something that I've done.
Yes.
Like, I'm somebody who's read my Audre Lorde in and out. I've read my bell hooks. Like,
Yes.
like, I've read my Janet Mock, because I think it's important to also, yeah, right, like, like, we're also writing ourselves into a lineage, but also we also paving the way, like, we're opening the door for the next generations. And I think it's also, there's a responsibility to this.
Yes.
So all this to say, so there's that part, and I think, that I want to acknowledge and make space for, and honor, in
Yes.
multiple
Absolutely.
ways. But no, I wasn't. I mean, I no, absolutely, it's been a journey. Like, I think I'm at this point right now. I think when I was younger, in my 20s, I think I was just very, very angry more than anything. I think I was somebody, as legitimately so, right? Like, I'm sure
Yes. Yes.
anybody who's going to listen to this will be able to relate
Yes.
to this. I mean, I work with youth so much. I see my youth, they pissed all the time. Like, like, I'm not
Yeah.
making this
Yeah.
up,
Yeah.
right? Like, but I think for me, at a point of time, there were like some questions that I had to ask myself, because
Yes.
one of the things that I realized with my anger was that, oh, being angry, like having this raging force, which I think is very, yeah, it's something probably in your, I mean, I tend to associate it to the 20s, to being younger, but at a point of time, the thing about this raging force, and I think anger is important, rage is important, particularly for us as
Yes.
marginalized people, but at the same time, it can burn everything down, including
Mhm.
including it can burn your own
Yes.
relationship with yourself. Because
Yes.
if you're like in the fire all the time, you're burning all the time, there's a point of
Yes.
time you need to come back up, you need to
Yes.
breathe, or you need to like tame that fire, right? Like, and one of the questions that was fundamental for me in terms of thinking about all of this, because for most of my life I had been in survival mode,
Yes.
including throughout my 20s. And it's only towards the end of my 20s that I actually started asking myself a question of what is the difference between surviving and thriving, right? Like, because surviving is important, right? Like, we all do it as marginalized people. It's the fight flight, it's what allows you to get out of your abusing homes, what like allows you to run away, what allows you to get by, to punch somebody in the face if they're attacking you, whatever it is, right? Like, survival mode, like whatever it is you need to do survive. And it's important. It's important. But at a point of time, once we have survived and you get safe, I think it's also very important to reevaluate each of your survival skills, because your
Yes.
survival skills are important, but all they do is they allow you to survive. And the
Yeah.
skills that allow you to survive are not necessarily the same skills that allow you to thrive.
Yes.
And for me, there was this moment where
Yes.
I had this major shift where I was like, I'm in survival mode.
Yes.
And that's when I started thinking about my relationship with rage a lot, where I
Mm.
was like, damn, I'm angry all the freaking time. And it's not good for me, right? Like, and then I was like, okay, so what is the alternative, right? Like, if that's, and there were a lot of things around this, like, in terms of like, but really, literally, I listed all my survival skills one by one. I realized, for example, my survival skills did not allow me to trust, because I didn't
Yeah.
trust anybody ever, which means that I was always lonely, because
Yeah.
I never even gave myself permission to rely on somebody else, because I didn't ever put in the time and the effort and the vulnerability to build trust, which makes sense, because I'm like, with the life that I've had walls around me my entire life,
Yes.
right? So at a point of time, I had to do that work of breaking down those walls
Yes.
and learning to trust and learning to love. And for me, I think I really thought through the question of like, what does it mean if I move away from rage? How do I then step into a politics of love and compassion?
Yes.
How do I then integrate that as a practice into my life? And so I think it's in so yeah, it's I think the question of surviving and thriving is something important to think about as marginalized people at a point of time, because the question of when it, of course, as traumatized people, as like whatever histories we have, of
Mhm.
course we have wars, but those wars are not what are gonna save us. They keep us safe, they keep us safe for a moment, but it's not what's gonna save you. And what's gonna save you is actually allowing love into your life and trusting other people. But to do that, you need to be able to be vulnerable. You need to be able to sit with your own discomfort, which is so hard to do, right? Like, and
Yes.
so um so I think no, I absolutely wasn't within like I think and I'm still growing, right? Like it's still a journey. I'm still
As we all
learning.
are. Yeah, exactly.
I'm still learning from my mentors, from my elders. I'm somebody who loves reading, so I read a lot. Like reading is my but also like I still do things from a place of humility, right? Of asking myself, who was there before me? What is it that they have to teach, to show, to learn? What is it that there is to learn from them? But also, and then thinking for the question of the next generations, like what is it that I want to leave behind, right? Like what is it that I want to inspire into? What are the stories that I want to leave behind, or the ways of being for the next generations? And that grounds me as well in terms of thinking beyond myself, like thinking beyond this lifetime, but like thinking
Yes.
in terms of the connection to the community, to the lineages again that are yet to come. Yeah.
What a beautiful answer. That's so wonderful, and I love that humility of talking about your support networks and both the family, both literal and more metaphysically, and the legacy that carries within you. And I think we get in such a capitalist mindset, especially in North America, about being me and amassing wealth and kind of being at the top, and we lose that communal sense of, my strength is the strength of others, and the strength of others is also my strength, and being in it together and acknowledging that have come before us and that will continue to come after us. And I love in particular that I think it's the opening poem that honors the divine femme. That was something that really resonated with a lot of um, our book club on Monday in particular, is that, that acknowledgement and that celebration of those that have come before us, especially the feminine, which has been so oppressed in so many ways over so many centuries and continues to be. And also thank you for your vulnerability and sharing part of your journey, because as well, for me, it's certainly been a journey and transformation and a lot of really soul searching, because um, being marginalized comes a lot of baggage, and it doesn't happen overnight, but to see where you've come, and that you're in a place where you can really give back and to open doors and to also mentor the next generation is fantastic. And it's wonderful that you're doing that also, that also you get to be part of the journey of someone else coming forward, and that it doesn't end there, and that kind of acknowledging of the part before and the part after, I think is really, really fantastic. So we're gonna move to questions soon, but I'm gonna close with a more fun question, because not that this is not important to talk about, but yeah, it's a lot to unpack, absolutely. And I'm looking at the time, I'm like, where's the time go? I feel like we talk for hours. It's amazing. But I would love to know about your style, which is so iconic and is so beautiful and so colorful. And how did you kind of find your style voice, and what are your style icons? I would love to know about your style, because it's so beautiful and so unique, but also classy. Yeah.
You mean my style,
What
right?
style, me?
You don't mean my writing style right now. You mean actually this.
Yes, that.
Oh, sweet. Oh my God, I love this question. I love this question. Uh, like I always, for the longest time, I used to run this monthly queer open mic called Gender Blender in
Yes,
Montreal.
very.
Like, used to happen every last Friday of the month, and I did it every single
Wow.
month for 5 years. And the idea was that it would be like a safe space for members of the
Yeah.
LGBTQ plus communities to just come and perform and do whatever they wanted on stage. And every single month, I did that for 5 years, every month. And and every month I would have a different outfit and a different hairdo and a different makeup, like every month,
Exactly.
and which was all gotten from Renaissance. Just to be clear, I don't spend money on my outfits, but yeah, but there was like an ongoing joke around it where, like, where for a while my bio said Kamala Mackerel is the most well-dressed woman of Montreal, and that was my one-line bio.
No
So
lie.
just to yeah, but I think I think there's something for me about, like, I mean, I do identify as a high femme. I'm somebody who loves doing the high femme from head to toe. Like,
Yes.
absolutely, that's absolutely me. But I think there's something I realized, particularly within the context of living in Canada, in North America, around colors. And I hadn't noticed this. Like, I had been here for a few years, and then I went back to Mauritius once after a few years of living here. And that's when I realized, I was like, oh my God, everything is so. I mean, the island itself is vibrant, right? Like, the
Yes.
sky is so much bluer over there because it's reflected in the ocean
Yes.
all the time. But
Absolutely.
the colors are so vibrant, and everything is so vibrant.
Hmm.
And people dress in a vibrant way. And also, I had lived in India for 5 years before moving to Canada, between Mauritius and Canada. So yeah, I think there's something for me about colors. Like, I love like, I love the vibrant colors. Like, I feel here we tend to, like, settle into the whites and the grays and the
Hmm.
blacks, like, into those
Yes.
shades. Even when you step out, I'm like,
That's
why
what
are
you
people
see.
so scared of colors? So
Yeah.
there's something for me where I'm like, I love certain, like, bright, vibrant colors. Like, that's very much like my wardrobe is, like, like, very vibrant in that
Yes.
sense. Yeah, I think that's something that definitely speaks to me. Yeah, and then generally speaking, yeah, no, I tend to do. I think I'm very influenced by my mother and the women of my family, to a certain extent, like the ways in which, like, they carry themselves. Like, I think part of, like, my style has to do in with my own reclaiming of my femininity,
Yes.
and yeah, so that's something. Uh, yeah, that's also something that I do love. I would say, uh, but yeah, it's true. It's interesting to see how, um, like, you stand out. Like, it's like, because I tend to wear vibrant colors, and, like, even walking on the streets, people like, whoa, like, there's something,
Uh,
for whatever reason, you're too visible, right? Like, you're
yeah.
too out there,
So much
and
color. Oh my.
yeah,
I'm scandalized.
yeah, and generally speaking, also, I love textures. I love flower patterns. Generally speaking, it's something that's
Yes.
very present in a lot of what I do. If I can integrate some sort of flower pattern somewhere, it's something that I always love. Yeah. I have to say, this sense of style, I need to figure it out now that, like, life is mostly happening on Zoom.
Yeah, exactly. It's a lot
Where I'm
better
just
to,
like, I don't get to show off my. I was supposed to be on a 6 weeks when I signed my publishing contract, which was
yes,
already which was a year ago, right?
yes,
We were like, we had already planned when 2020 started. I
yes,
thought that in September and October I would be doing a 6 week cross Canada tour.
yes,
That was the plan with the book. I would be on a book
yes,
tour, and I had already planned it. I was like, I'm gonna wear a different outfit in each
yes.
city.
Absolutely. That's the opportunity. Just share
Yeah,
it across the
but
country.
yeah, but I'm doing. I mean, it's not the same, but I'm doing an online. I'm doing a virtual tour,
Oh,
a book
excellent.
tour,
Yeah.
starting November 17th in Montreal, and then
Uh,
until December 1st. So I'm doing, like, Montreal, Halifax, Ottawa, all online, of course. But, like, I'm doing a bunch of gigs to promote the book in November. So now I'm thinking about it. I'm like, what can I do from here to
yes.
here?
Yeah, exactly. You have to do extra to compensate for the rest you can't
Exactly.
see.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. And I'm so happy to hear that that's still happening. And I definitely hope that, and same with me as well, so many things in person have been canceled, that one day we will have this beautiful in person experience, because I think it really does have to be seen and felt, and, through the visuals and your voice and everything, to really go beyond the page. But at least we have something to look forward to. So
Yeah.
I'm glad, because that after so much work and after getting to this point, I mean, it's definitely difficult. And then for that to be, you know, taken away, but it's gonna happen at some point, and it's already happening in different ways. So I'm just so happy to see your resilience and your enthusiasm, and it will just continue to shine forth. Absolutely.
Thank
Is there
you. Thank you.
anything? Yes, you're welcome. And is there anything you'd like to leave us with before I stop the recording? Although I feel like talking about the fashion is already like such an iconic, you know, iconic summary. You know, it's talking about, you know, colors in terms of fashion, but I think literally that's, you know, more color and more just everyone being their total vibrant self more. But is there anything else you'd like to leave us
Yeah.
with?
I mean, I just want to say, like, as you know, I mean, this was supposed to be a performance, but like, there's no theater and live performance happening at the moment. So I do want to plug in, like, if you don't have a copy of the book, you can always, if you want to get yourself a copy of the book, it makes a great Christmas present. I think one of the things about this book is like, so far, people like reading it independent, like, it's not a genre, it's not like an academic thing, for example, that's like like, I think anybody can pick it up and read it and still have fun with it, but also, encourage your local bookstore to stock them.
Yes.
If you're part of any library, whether it's your university library or community library, ask them to order it, because I think that's just like a way of supporting artists and writers in the long term, is making sure that, like, your bookstores know about the book, but also if your library, it's like, for every book that a library orders in Canada, like, you get like an artist fee or whatever, a copyright fee or whatever, but like, just a small way of just supporting artists and writers at the moment. So I do encourage you to talk about the book, tweet about it if you like it, even if you don't like it, if you're on Goodreads, write a review or star it. Those are just really tiny things, but they're actually tiny things that can go a long way in terms of, like, supporting artists in the long term. So that's, yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. And it paves the way for other amazing, diverse voices to be heard because, you know, then the bookstores, libraries will be picking up on things that readers want to see and are enthusiastic about. So, absolutely have to make
Mhm.
our voices heard. And that's so beautiful. And I have to say as well, I pre ordered mine and I love this handwritten ribbon. So it's so beautiful, and I'm glad I had this opportunity to have my special copy of this. But yeah, whether it's a PDF or a physical copy, and especially, you know, I think that's beautiful. You know, send it to a loved one that you can't see in person who's afar. You know, so yes, this has been absolutely wonderful, and we're gonna take some time to field some questions from our live Zoom audience here. Otherwise, it's been an amazing experience talking to you, and I'm just gonna stop the recording here. And so grateful to have Kama here with us today, and also with their new books on them. And what a beautiful conversation. Thank you, merci.